Officer, stop him! He can't leave until the HOA gives permission.
Every fee is paid. You're the only one breaking the law by blocking my driveway.
Ma'am, this is not an HOA emergency. Move your vehicle immediately!
I was taping up my final moving box when flashing police lights illuminated my driveway. The HOA dictator stood on my lawn, smirking like she'd finally destroyed me. She thought she was having me arrested for leaving. She had no idea I had just secretly purchased her entire neighborhood block. When I bought my house in the upscale gated community of Maplewood Terrace, I thought I had finally made it. I was 34, working 60-hour weeks in commercial real estate acquisitions, and all I wanted was a quiet, pristine neighborhood where I could relax on the weekends. The houses were gorgeous, the lawns were manicured, and the streets were lined with old-growth oak trees. It looked like an absolute paradise. I should have known that paradise always has a snake lurking somewhere in the grass. In Maplewood Terrace, that snake went by the name of Patricia Higgins. Patricia was a woman in her late 50s who treated her position as president of the Homeowners Association like she was the supreme commander of a small sovereign nation. She drove a silver Lexus SUV that she used as a patrol vehicle, crawling down the streets at 5 miles per hour, with a clipboard resting on her steering wheel. She had a perfectly stiff blonde bob that never seemed to move, even in the wind, and a resting expression that always looked like she had just smelled sour milk. I hadn't even lived in the neighborhood for a full 48 hours before I received my first citation. I remember walking out to my driveway on a Tuesday morning to find a neon green sticker slapped onto my mailbox. It was a formal HOA violation warning. The offense? My moving boxes were visible through the glass panes of my front door, which apparently violated a community guideline against unsightly interior clutter visible from the public right-of-way. I laughed it off, assuming it was a joke, or maybe an overzealous welcome to the neighborhood prank by a neighbor. It wasn't. 2 days later, a formal letter arrived assessing a $200 fine because the boxes hadn't been removed within the mandated 24-hour grace period. That was just the beginning. Over the next year, my life became a relentless, exhausting game of cat and mouse with Patricia and her loyal lackey, a retired accountant named Gary Wallace who acted as her enforcer. They fined me for everything. They measured my grass with a literal ruler. I received a $300 fine because my landscaping service cut the grass to 1.5 inches instead of the community-mandated 2 inches. I was written up because my trash cans were left at the curb for an hour too long after the garbage truck had passed. Once, when my brother came to visit, his daughter drew a smiling sun on my driveway with sidewalk chalk. Patricia had a pressure washing company come out to remove it, billed me $400 for the service, and added a $100 penalty for vandalism to community aesthetics. I tried to be reasonable at first. I attended the monthly HOA meetings, thinking I could talk some sense into the board. I quickly learned that the board was nothing more than a rubber stamp for Patricia's petty grievances. Whenever I tried to speak, she would bang a ridiculous wooden gavel and declare me out of order. My neighbor, a great guy named Tom Henderson, warned me to keep my head down. He told me that Patricia had managed to force 3 different families to sell their homes because she had buried them in endless legal fees and liens over minor infractions. She thrived on the power, feeding her ego by making everyone else absolutely miserable. The breaking point came during a stormy weekend in October. A massive branch from one of the community oak trees snapped and crashed onto my roof, shattering a skylight and damaging my gutters. I immediately called an emergency roofing contractor to come out and tarp the hole before the rain ruined my hardwood floors. The contractor parked his truck in the street since my driveway was blocked by the fallen branch and rushed up to the roof to work. Less than 20 minutes later, I heard yelling. I ran outside in the pouring rain to find Patricia standing next to a tow truck she had personally called. The tow truck driver was hooking up my contractor's vehicle. Patricia stood under a massive golf umbrella, a smug, satisfied grin plastered across her face. When I demanded to know what on earth she was doing, she calmly cited an HOA bylaw that prohibited unauthorized commercial vehicles from parking on community streets without a 48-hour prior written approval. She had my contractor's truck towed while he was standing on my roof, trying to save my house from water damage. I ended up having to pay the contractor for his lost time, pay the impound fee, and pay another $500 fine to the HOA. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I just stood there in the rain, looking at Patricia's triumphant face, and realized I was done playing defense. I worked in commercial real estate acquisitions. My entire career was built on finding leverage, identifying distressed assets, and executing quiet, ruthless buyouts. I decided right then and there that I wasn't just going to move out of Maplewood Terrace. I was going to ruin Patricia Higgins's little kingdom. I started digging into the public property records. Maplewood Terrace was a sprawling community, but Patricia didn't actually live in the single-family homes. She lived in a subsection called the townhomes at Maplewood, an exclusive row of luxury townhouses situated on a private block just inside the community gates. What almost nobody in the neighborhood knew was that the townhomes weren't individually owned. They had been built by a corporate developer who leased them out on strict, long-term luxury rent-to-own contracts. Patricia didn't own her home. She was technically a tenant holding a 99-year land lease. And through my industry contacts, I discovered something incredible. The corporate developer, who owned her entire block, was quietly liquidating assets to avoid filing for bankruptcy. I formed a shell LLC, pooled my liquid assets, secured a massive commercial loan, and began the quietest, most satisfying negotiation of my entire life. I was going to buy the block. It took nearly 4 months to finalize the purchase of the townhomes at Maplewood. During that time, I put my own house on the market as a pocket listing, selling it quietly to a wealthy investor from out of state, so Patricia wouldn't see the for sale sign and get the satisfaction of thinking she had driven me out. I kept paying her ridiculous fines without a single word of complaint. I paid the improper holiday decoration fine when she claimed my string lights were too bright. I paid the noise ordinance violation fine when I dropped a heavy box in my own garage. I smiled at her when she drove by in her Lexus. I let her think she had completely broken my spirit. Finally, the day arrived. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when the massive 18-wheel moving truck backed into my driveway. I had hired a premium moving crew to pack up the entire house in a single day. I was standing on my porch, sipping a cup of coffee and watching the movers load my leather sofa, when I heard the familiar squeal of brakes. Patricia's silver Lexus violently swerved to the curb, parking diagonally across the end of my driveway, so that the moving truck was completely blocked in. She practically leaped out of her SUV, clutching her ever-present clipboard to her chest like a shield. Gary Wallace was scurrying right behind her, looking nervous, but eager for a confrontation. "You can't leave," Patricia screeched, her voice echoing down the quiet suburban street. "Stop loading that truck, immediately." I took a slow sip of my coffee, stepped off the porch, and walked down to the driveway. "Good morning, Patricia. I'm moving. The house is sold. It's been a real pleasure, but my time here is done." "The house is sold?" Her eyes darted around frantically, completely caught off guard. "You didn't submit a property transfer request. You didn't pay the community exit fee. You have 3 outstanding infractions, totaling $850, and until those are paid in full, you are not permitted to vacate the premises." "Actually, Patricia," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm, "my lawyer wired the outstanding balance to the HOA management account at 8 o'clock this morning. Every single fine is paid. The exit fee is paid. I don't owe you a single dime. And you are currently blocking a commercial vehicle. Move your car." Patricia's face turned a violent shade of crimson. "I am the president of this HOA. I dictate who comes and goes. I have not verified those funds." "Gary, write him up for an unauthorized commercial truck on the premises. That's a $1,000 fine." "Gary can write whatever he wants on his little notepad," I replied. "But I don't live here anymore. Now, move the Lexus, or I'll have it towed." You taught me how efficient that can be, remember? That was the wrong thing to say. Patricia's eyes went wide with pure rage. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out her phone, and dialed 911. Yes, police? I have an emergency at Maplewood Terrace. A resident is attempting to flee the community without settling his debts, and he is threatening me with violence. Send officers immediately. I couldn't help it. I actually laughed out loud. The moving crew paused, looking at me for direction, and I just waved them on to keep working. 15 minutes later, the flashing lights of a patrol cruiser reflected off the side of the moving truck. Officer Brian Jenkins stepped out of his vehicle, looking completely exasperated as he took in the scene. A moving truck, a blocked driveway, and a woman in a pastel cardigan screaming about community bylaws. Who called? Officer Jenkins asked, resting his hand casually on his duty belt. I did, officer. Patricia rushed forward, practically shoving her clipboard into his face. This man is a delinquent resident. He is attempting a clandestine move-out without board approval. He owes the community thousands in fines, and he threatened to have my vehicle destroyed. Officer Jenkins looked at me. Is this true, sir? I'm moving out, officer, I said calmly, handing him the settlement paperwork from my attorney. The house was sold yesterday. All HOA dues and fines were settled by wire transfer this morning. I have the receipts right here. She is using her vehicle to barricade my movers, effectively trapping us on my private property. Jenkins reviewed the paperwork, nodding slowly. He then turned to Patricia, and his expression hardened. Ma'am, this is a civil matter, not a criminal one. And you cannot block someone from leaving their own property. You need to move your vehicle right now. You don't understand, Patricia shrilled, her voice cracking. I am the president of the Maplewood Terrace Homeowners Association. My authority supersedes. Ma'am, Officer Jenkins interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. Your authority doesn't mean a damn thing to me. You are currently committing the crime of false imprisonment by blocking this vehicle, and you have misused the 911 emergency system. Move the Lexus in the next 10 seconds, or I will arrest you, put you in the back of my cruiser, and have the city tow your car. 10, 9, 8. Patricia gasped, looking like she had just been slapped. She looked at Gary, but Gary was already shuffling backward, wanting no part of this. Trembling with fury, she stomped back to her SUV, slammed the door, and aggressively backed out of the way. She rolled down her window, pointing a shaking finger at me. You think you've won. I will lien this property. I will sue you for everything you have. You are nothing. I smiled, tipped my coffee cup toward her, and watched her speed away. I thanked the officer, told the movers to finish up, and climbed into my own car. I wasn't just driving away to a new house. I was driving straight to the law offices of Robert Swenson. An hour later, I sat in Bob's mahogany-paneled conference room. On the table between us sat a stack of documents, roughly 3 inches thick. It was the finalized deed and transfer of ownership for the corporate entity that owned the townhomes at Maplewood. I picked up the pen and signed my name on the final line. Bob smiled, sliding a folder across the desk. Congratulations, Liam. You are officially the sole owner of the entire townhome block. 72 luxury units, the clubhouse, the private road, and every single land lease attached to them. And the property management rights? I asked, feeling a grin spread across my face. Fully transferred to your LLC, Bob confirmed. You are now their landlord. You control their leases, their maintenance, and according to the original developer's incredibly strict bylaws, you have unilateral authority over the architectural guidelines and exterior aesthetic standards for that specific subsection. I opened the folder. Sitting right on top was the lease file for Unit 114, Patricia Higgins. The beauty of commercial real estate is that it operates entirely on paper. When I bought the townhomes at Maplewood, I didn't buy them under my own name. I created a holding company called Apex Residential Management. To the residents of the 72 luxury townhomes, they simply received a polite, legally mandated letter in the mail stating that the original corporate developer had transferred ownership of the properties to a new management firm. They were instructed to direct all future rent payments, maintenance requests, and architectural inquiries to a new corporate address, which was essentially a P.O. box managed by my attorney, Robert Swenson. For the first 2 weeks, I did absolutely nothing. I wanted Patricia Higgins to feel perfectly safe. I wanted her to settle back into a routine of terrorizing the neighborhood, driving her silver Lexus down the streets and handing out ridiculous fines with her trusty clipboard. I wanted her to think I was just a defeated resident who had fled her kingdom with my tail tucked between my legs. In the meantime, I sat in my downtown office and meticulously read through the master lease agreement for the townhomes. The original developer had drafted an incredibly heavy-handed lease to protect their investment. Section 4, paragraph B caught my eye immediately. The landlord reserves the absolute and unilateral right to enforce strict exterior aesthetic standards. Any modifications, decorations, or non-standard landscaping visible from the exterior must receive written approval from the landlord. The landlord may, at their discretion, mandate the immediate removal of any unapproved exterior elements at the tenant's expense. Patricia had spent her entire tenure as HOA president using the community bylaws as a weapon. She had forgotten that, as a townhome tenant, she was subject to an even higher, more ruthless authority, her lease. I hired a no-nonsense property manager named Bradley Dawson. Bradley was a former military logistics officer who had transitioned into property management. He was devoid of emotion, strictly by the book, and absolutely terrifying to deal with if you were breaking the rules. I gave him a very specific assignment: conduct a comprehensive exterior audit of Unit 114, the residence of Patricia Higgins, and apply the lease terms with zero tolerance. On a Tuesday afternoon, Bradley walked the property line of Unit 114. He took dozens of high-resolution photographs. Then, he drafted the notices. 2 days later, Patricia received a certified package from Apex Residential Management. It wasn't just a letter. It was a small binder of lease violations. First, the expensive, custom-painted terracotta pots flanking her front door were deemed non-compliant with the corporate uniform aesthetic policy. Second, her beloved, award-winning rose bushes, which she had planted in the common planting bed without corporate approval 5 years ago, were classified as an unauthorized landscape modification. Third, the monogrammed brass door knocker she had installed was cited as vandalism of corporate property. The icing on the cake, however, was her patio furniture. Patricia had an expensive wrought iron patio set sitting on her back terrace. The lease explicitly stated that only neutral-toned, standard-issue outdoor seating was permitted on the townhome patios to ensure a cohesive look from the golf course behind the properties. Bradley Dawson's letter gave her precisely 48 hours to remove the pots, dig up the rose bushes, uninstall the door knocker, and dispose of the patio furniture. Failure to comply would result in Apex Residential Management dispatching a maintenance crew to confiscate the unauthorized items, bill her for the labor, and assess a $500 penalty per violation per day as outlined in her lease. I was sitting in my living room, miles away in my new house, when my phone rang. It was Bradley. "Boss," Bradley said, his voice entirely flat. "I just got off the phone with the tenant at Unit 114. She is incredibly distressed. She screamed at me for 12 straight minutes." "Did you explain the lease terms to her?" I asked, grinning from ear to ear. "I read Section 4, paragraph B, to her verbatim," Bradley replied. "She threatened to use her power as the HOA president to fine our holding company for harassment." I informed her that the HOA has no legal jurisdiction over the landlord-tenant lease agreements within the townhome subsection, and that any retaliatory fines from the HOA would be considered a breach of the covenant of good faith, triggering immediate eviction proceedings. And what did she say to that? She dropped the phone, sir. I heard something shatter in the background, and then the line went dead. The next morning, I drove out to Maplewood Terrace and parked down the street from the townhomes, blending in with the landscape crew's vehicles. I watched in absolute unadulterated delight as Patricia Higgins, the woman who had tormented dozens of families, who had fined me for my moving boxes, who had towed my roofing contractor in the rain, was forced to carry her heavy terracotta pots to the community dumpster. She was wearing gardening gloves and a stained sweatshirt, her usually perfect hair sticking to her forehead with sweat. Gary Wallace, her loyal lackey, was out there with her, awkwardly trying to help her dig up her prized rose bushes before Bradley Dawson's 48-hour deadline expired. Patricia looked utterly defeated, her face red and blotchy as she aggressively hacked at the roots of her beloved flowers. She had spent years weaponizing rules against everyone else, and now the rules were finally being weaponized against her. But I wasn't done. The real masterstroke was yet to come. Later that week, Patricia decided she wasn't going to take this lying down. If she couldn't fight her landlord directly, she was going to use the HOA board to rewrite the community bylaws to strip the corporate landlord of its aesthetic authority. She distributed flyers across the entire neighborhood, calling for an emergency mandatory meeting of the Maplewood Terrace Homeowners Association. The flyer claimed that a predatory corporate entity was trying to destroy the fabric of the community and that she needed an emergency vote to pass a new set of sweeping regulations that would force Apex Residential Management to submit to her board's absolute control. She thought she was rallying her troops to save her kingdom. She didn't realize she was setting the stage for her own public execution. The community clubhouse was packed on the night of the emergency meeting. Normally, HOA meetings at Maplewood Terrace were sparsely attended affairs, mostly consisting of Patricia, Gary, and a few retired folks who liked to complain about the trash collection schedule. But Patricia's frantic flyers had whipped the neighborhood into a frenzy. People were terrified that some faceless Wall Street corporation was going to bulldoze the townhomes or turn them into short-term rentals. I arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a tailored navy suit and carrying a slim leather briefcase. I slipped into the back of the room and leaned against the wall, watching the circus unfold. Patricia was standing at the front of the room behind a folding table, aggressively banging her wooden gavel. Gary Wallace sat beside her, looking pale and nervous as he shuffled through a stack of printed resolutions. Patricia's hair was back to its stiff, unmoving perfection, and she was wearing a bright red blazer that practically screamed authority. "Order! I call this meeting to order," Patricia shouted into the microphone, the feedback whining sharply through the clubhouse speakers. "We are here tonight to address a critical threat to our community. A shadow corporation known as Apex Residential Management has acquired the townhome properties and is attempting to enforce rogue, unauthorized architectural standards that defy this board's authority." A murmur of concern rippled through the crowd of homeowners. My old neighbor, Tom Henderson, was sitting in the third row. He looked worried. "I have drafted a new resolution," Patricia continued, holding up a thick stack of paper. "Resolution 84C. This will amend the master community bylaws to state that no corporate landlord may enforce exterior standards without the express written consent of the HOA president. Furthermore, it institutes a daily fine of $1,000 against Apex Residential Management for every day they attempt to harass our residents." She looked incredibly smug. She thought she had found the ultimate loophole. She was going to use the community's democratic process to shield herself from her own lease. "Now," Patricia announced, puffing out her chest, "according to our bylaws, we need a simple majority vote from the property owners present to pass this amendment. Do I have a motion to vote? Excuse me, Patricia, I called out from the back of the room. My voice cut through the silence like a knife. Every head in the clubhouse whipped around to look at me. Tom Henderson's jaw dropped. Patricia's eyes widened in sheer disbelief, the color draining from her face for a fraction of a second before her expression hardened into a mask of pure fury. You, she hissed, pointing a manicured finger at me. What are you doing here? You don't live in this community anymore. You sold your property. This is a closed meeting for homeowners only. Gary, call community security and have this trespasser removed immediately. Gary picked up his phone, but I held up my hand, stepping away from the wall and walking slowly down the center aisle. Actually, Patricia, I have every right to be here, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. Bylaw Article 2, Section 1 states that any legal property owner within the Maplewood Terrace boundaries is entitled to attend and vote in all general and emergency meetings. You sold your house, she shrieked, her voice cracking. I checked the county records myself. You do not own a home in this neighborhood. You're right. I sold my single-family home on Elm Street, I replied calmly, reaching the front of the room and opening my leather briefcase. I pulled out a stack of legally certified, notarized documents, but I didn't leave the neighborhood. I just diversified my portfolio. I dropped the documents onto the table right in front of her. I am the sole managing member and owner of Apex Residential Management, I announced, looking her dead in the eyes. I own the townhomes, Patricia. I own the clubhouse we are standing in. I own the private roads connecting them. And most importantly, I own your lease. The room erupted into shocked gasps. Tom Henderson actually let out a loud, booming laugh from the third row. Patricia stared at the documents, her hands trembling so violently that the papers rattled against the table. You, she stammered, completely unable to form a coherent sentence. Her face went from pale to a dangerous shade of purple. But that's not why I'm speaking tonight, I continued, turning to face the crowd of baffled homeowners. Patricia has called for a vote on Resolution 84C. She wants to pass a rule protecting herself from her landlord. The bylaws state that passing an amendment requires a simple majority of voting shares. I turned back to Patricia, leaning over the table. Here's the problem with your math, Patricia, I said softly, but loud enough for the microphone to pick it up. In Maplewood Terrace, every individual property address is assigned one voting share in the HOA. There are 40 single-family homes in this neighborhood, but there are 72 townhomes. Because I own all 72 townhomes, my corporate entity holds 72 individual voting shares. I hold the absolute, undeniable majority voting power of this entire homeowners association. Gary Wallace dropped his pen. It clattered loudly onto the floor. I oppose Resolution 84C, I stated formally. Therefore, the motion fails. Patricia looked like she was going to have a stroke. She gripped the edges of the folding table, her knuckles turning white. You cannot do this. This is a dictatorship. This is a conflict of interest. No, Patricia, I smiled. It's real estate. And since I hold the majority voting block, I would like to introduce my own motion to the floor. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Pursuant to Article 5, Section 3 of the Master Bylaws, the community may hold an immediate vote of no confidence to recall and remove any sitting member of the HOA Board of Directors, I read aloud. I am casting my 72 votes to immediately and permanently remove Patricia Higgins from the position of HOA President. The clubhouse went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. I second the motion, Tom Henderson yelled from the third row, standing up and clapping his hands. Suddenly, half the room was standing up, clapping and cheering. Years of suppressed anger and resentment toward Patricia's tyranny were flooding out in a wave of applause. Patricia Higgins stood frozen behind the table, stripped of her crown, her clipboard, and her power. But the nightmare for her was only just beginning. I wasn't just taking her presidency. I was about to make her life, as a tenant, a living hell. The immediate aftermath of the clubhouse meeting was nothing short of a suburban revolution. Once Patricia Higgins stormed out of the double doors, her face a terrifying mask of humiliation and rage, the remaining homeowners immediately got to work. With my 72 voting shares backing the motion, we swiftly elected Tom Henderson as the new president of the Maplewood Terrace Homeowners Association. Tom's first official act, passed unanimously, was to dissolve the ridiculous aesthetic committees and waive all pending unpaid fines that Patricia had maliciously issued over the past 6 months. Gary Wallace, terrified of the shifting power dynamics, officially resigned from the board via a hastily typed email the very next morning. For the neighborhood, peace had finally been restored. For Patricia, the nightmare was just shifting into second gear. Instead of accepting her defeat gracefully, Patricia decided to wage a one-woman war of attrition against Apex Residential Management. She mistakenly believed that because she possessed a 99-year land lease, she was functionally untouchable, regardless of what her corporate landlord dictated. She started by blatantly ignoring Bradley Dawson's notices. She refused to pay the daily fines for her unapproved exterior modifications. Then, in a spectacular display of petty rebellion, she hired a cheap contractor to paint her front door, a blinding fluorescent shade of magenta. She also stopped paying her monthly luxury lease maintenance fees, placing the funds into a sham escrow account and sending me a demanding letter through a discount legal clinic. She claimed she was withholding rent due to harassment and emotional distress caused by her landlord. It was the biggest mistake she could have possibly made. If there is one thing you never do in commercial real estate, it is willfully breach a corporate lease agreement by withholding rent without a legitimate, court-sanctioned habitability issue. By stopping her payments and intentionally defacing the exterior of the property with the magenta paint, she handed me the exact legal ammunition I needed to terminate her 99-year lease entirely. I didn't bother sending any more warning letters or fines. I simply had Robert Swenson file a formal eviction lawsuit in county court. The hearing took place 4 weeks later. Patricia showed up in her signature red blazer, carrying 2 massive canvas tote bags overflowing with disorganized printed emails, photographs of her rose bushes, and a printed copy of the HOA bylaws. She looked utterly manic. I sat quietly at the plaintiff's table with Bob, wearing a sharp suit and holding a single, neatly tabbed manila folder. When the magistrate, Judge Abigail Bennett, called our case, Patricia immediately launched into a frantic, breathless tirade. She talked over the judge, rambling about how I was a disgruntled former resident, executing a vendetta, how she was the rightful ruler of the neighborhood, and how the magenta door was a constitutionally protected expression of protest. Judge Bennett, a stern woman who clearly had zero patience for sovereign citizen-style theatrics, slammed her gavel down hard. "Miss Higgins, you are a tenant," Judge Bennett stated firmly, cutting off Patricia's rant. "You signed a binding corporate lease agreement. The plaintiff has provided undisputed documentation that you are in arrears for over $3,000 in maintenance fees and that you have willfully violated the exterior modification clauses of your contract. Your historical status as an HOA board member has absolutely zero legal bearing on your obligations as a tenant to your landlord." Patricia opened her mouth to argue, but the judge held up a hand. "I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff," Judge Bennett declared, signing the paperwork on her desk. "Your lease is formally terminated due to multiple material breaches. You have exactly 14 days to vacate the premises, or the county sheriff will physically remove you." Watching the realization wash over Patricia's face was one of the most profoundly satisfying moments of my life. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The impenetrable armor of entitlement she had worn for years completely shattered right there in the courtroom. 14 days later, on a brisk Thursday morning, I drove into Maplewood Terrace and parked my car across the street from Unit 114. I brought a large thermos of premium coffee and leaned against my hood, enjoying the crisp morning air. At exactly 9 o'clock, a White County Sheriff's cruiser pulled up to the curb, followed closely by a large box truck operated by a court-appointed eviction crew. Sheriff Deputy Carl Evans stepped up to the fluorescent magenta door and knocked heavily. Patricia Higgins opened the door, wearing a silk bathrobe, her hair completely unstyled. When she saw the deputy and the moving crew, she absolutely lost her mind. She started screaming, crying, and physically trying to block the doorway. Deputy Evans remained perfectly calm, expertly sidestepping her and escorting her out onto the front lawn, while the eviction crew systematically began carrying her belongings out of the townhouse. In an incredible display of irony, Patricia reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and dialed 911. "Yes, police. I need emergency assistance," she shrieked, pacing back and forth on the grass as her expensive furniture was unceremoniously deposited onto the public sidewalk. "There are men in my house. They are stealing my belongings. Send someone immediately." Less than 10 minutes later, a local patrol car arrived. To my absolute delight, it was Officer Brian Jenkins, the exact same officer Patricia had called on me months ago when I was moving out. Officer Jenkins stepped out of his vehicle, took one look at the sheriff's cruiser, the eviction crew, and Patricia crying on the lawn, and let out a heavy sigh. He walked over to Deputy Evans, exchanged a few quiet words and a nod, and then turned to Patricia. "Word." "Ma'am," Officer Jenkins said, his voice dripping with tired irony. "This is a civil eviction being executed by the county court. I have no jurisdiction here. You need to gather your belongings and vacate the premises, or you will be arrested for trespassing." Patricia stopped crying. She looked at Officer Jenkins, then at the pile of her worldly possessions sitting on the concrete. Finally, her eyes drifted across the street and locked onto me. I didn't say a word. I didn't gloat. I simply raised my coffee thermos, tipped it toward her in a silent toast, and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip. Patricia Higgins ended up having to rent a U-Haul truck herself that afternoon, furiously tossing her belongings into the back while the entire neighborhood casually watched from their porches. Once she was gone, I had a crew repaint the front door to its original, tasteful charcoal gray. I eventually rented the unit out to a lovely young couple with 2 golden retrievers, the exact type of dogs Patricia used to try and ban from the community. Maplewood Terrace became the paradise it was always meant to be, and I secured one of the most profitable real estate investments of my career. Sometimes, the best way to deal with a neighborhood tyrant isn't to fight their petty rules, but to buy the board they play on. If you loved hearing how Patricia's reign of terror was finally brought to an end, please hit that like button and share this story with anyone who has ever suffered under a crazy HOA. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more insane, real-life revenge stories just like this one. Thanks for watching.